Hello, welcome to this video. Recently I did an A to Z of prog. I followed that up with an A to Z of jazz rock, and I really enjoy doing these, but they are a bit of a challenge because rather than doing a top 10, we got 26 here. And of course, an A to Z isn't a top 10. And I'm going to explain it for the third time for those of you who don't realize what we're doing here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get an alphabet for that genre, okay? And so you think of A. So you go, right, with jazz, so put Armstrong. So what you have to do is have one word that if you're a jazz fan, you know what that word means. We can't have two words or a sentence, it has to be one word. So if I say Armstrong, you know, a regular person won't go, well, Neil Armstrong, who was the first man on the moon. But we know in jazz, if we say Armstrong, we mean Louis Armstrong. And so we write Armstrong in. And then when we get down the page, right, we realise that we've missed out Art Tatum, say. And we go, well, shall I put him on A? I can't because Armstrong's there, and then you look at the T, and you've got and think Art Tatum's are going to have to go on it, you know. And so when it does take a while to get them. This took me about 2 weeks to get this list, and I still don't think it's right. So it's more a game. I could start again. You could do this over and over again and see what you come up with. And what you want to have is you want to have basically 26 words. Those words, you know exactly who they're referring to, and they should be worthy of being in this list, so they represent something really important in jazz. Certain people have to be here, so you have to get them on the list. I might have missed a few out. You might say there's no so-and-so, and I go, oh my God, they really do need to be on the list. And then you almost have to start again because you realise that letter's taken up. And I enjoy it, so it's not like a top 10. This is like my attempt to do this. If you're bored, you know, try doing it. Pick a genre and try to do it A to Z, and you'll see the enjoyment that you get from trying to pull this off. So it doesn't have to just be people's names, any word connecting with jazz, as long as you can get through it and tell the story. So we're going to start with the letter A.
Hee it's the A to Z of jazz with your favourite YouTuber, Andy Edwards.
And for A, I have, it's actually 2 words, I'm cheating straight off, Now, is the 1959 album by Charles Mingus, also known as Charlie Mingus to some. Charlie Mingus is a bass player that emerged in the bebop period, late 40s, started being playing virtuoso bass player, very influenced by Duke Ellington, and brought a almost big band compositional approach to large group playing. Not huge, not big bands, but larger groups. He developed a group throughout the 1950s where he was utilising large-scale improvisation, but structuring that group in a way where you could see the beginnings of free jazz. One of the reasons for this is because Charles Mingus seemed to have a really great idea about history and jazz history. And one of the things he went back was to the utilisation of group improvisation and a sort of Ellington way of incorporating instrumentalists into his compositions. His stuff also pushes at the limits of jazz, especially at that time. In 1959, he makes one of his masterpiece albums called R. Now, R. Actually is a sort of tribute to a whole, you know, remit of jazz masters. So by putting R on, I sort of get all those on. So we have Goodbye Pork by Hat, which is a tribute to Lester Young, who had died that year or the year before. Now, the name R comes from Latin declensions, right? So if you think you were saying the word Ming, you would have Mingus, Mingar, Mingum. And so it's a bit like saying Mingus for me, Mingus for you, and Mingus for everybody. And that's what you have with this album. This album is incredibly eclectic. It's incredibly approachable. It's incredibly creative. It's one of the great jazz albums all time. Now, I'm not a huge Mingus aficionado, and I do like him. My favourite album is Tijuana Moods, because that's the one I grew up with incredible Isabel's Table Dance. But this is one of those albums, one of the great albums, one of the albums from the 1950s, and a brilliant representation of Charlie Mingus, who's an artist I tend to skate over here on this channel, and I shouldn't, so I've got him straight up. Right, so B is for Bechet, as in Sidney Bechet. Yes, the great soprano sax player from the beginnings of jazz. And so Sidney Bechet was born 4 years before Louis Armstrong, and he emerges in the early period of jazz before recording, and he is perhaps the first great virtuoso improviser of that period. Sidney Bechet was Creole, so he had influences coming in from the sort of African American line. He also had the Spanish influences, and in Bechet's case, the French influences. He spoke French, and there was a very strong influence of French culture in what he did. But what's interesting is he had lessons on clarinet from the Tio family. The Tio family are actually, I think they were Spanish actually, but they brought in a sort of Italian way of playing clarinet, which is a different technical approach, which enabled virtuosity and improvisation to happen. This is one of the key moments in jazz. So Sidney Bechet almost represents everything that is at play in jazz at that time. By the time he starts recording in the 1920s, him and Louis Armstrong are the great virtuoso. And of course, he moves after a trip to France. He's one of the first artists to go to France. Actually, one of the first artists to be recognised as being a virtuoso by European classical musicians as well in the 1920s. He's one of the first musicians to actually spread the word of jazz out into the world. Bechet is so important. If you want to hear an early jazz musician, go and check out Sidney Bechet, because the way he plays speaks to you. And it sounds unlike anybody else. And on his trip to France, in the early 20s, he discovered the soprano saxophone, and he took up the soprano saxophone, becoming really, along with Coleman Hawkins, the sort of originators of the saxophone as an instrument that would become so important in jazz. So Sidney Bechet is a bit of a heavyweight, without a doubt. I absolutely love him as well. I mean, some early jazz is I could listen to in my historian's ears and enjoy it from that point of view. But Bechet, the emotional context of his playing, the way he can play a tune, that fast vibrato and the expression. When I was doing research on Sidney Bechet, I read someone who'd had lessons from Bechet, and basically the lesson was you had to learn how to play one note as many ways as you possibly can. How many ways you can play a note, and with that's the difference between jazz virtuosity and classical music virtuosity. So that's what we've got for B. C is for Coltrane, as in John Coltrane. What can I say about John Coltrane that I haven't said on this channel before? He stands there and dominates like jazz. He dominates it from a point of view as a soloist. Yes, he composed. Yes, he made classic albums. But when we think Coltrane, we think of the way that he improvises. And he improvises in a way where he is connected to what we could say is something beyond our normal way of perceiving the world, perhaps. It's in jazz musicians before John Coltrane comes along, but it's not accentuated and focused like John Coltrane brings to the music at that time. It's a certain way of playing where you're at once expressing something divine and peaceful, but also he's expressing some sort of angst and inability to situate yourself in the world comfortably. All that's in Coltrane's playing. The way he solos brought about one of the great groups in jazz history with Elvin Jones on drums, McCoy Tyner on piano, and Jimmy Garrison on bass. And they basically found a way of integrating into Coltrane's energy, which changed the face of music. What can I say? You know, he starts off in you know, the backline of Dizzy Gillespie's band, I believe, in the 1940s, late 40s. He's around people like Charlie Parker and Miles Davis. He comes up through the 1950s riddled with sort of drug problems and teeth problems. He was addicted to sweets, so he ended up having terrible teeth, which would cause him pain when he played. And then in 57, he seems to get his act together, most likely from joining Thelonious Monk's band, which is an incredible thing for Coltrane. He sort of comes out of that changed, has a spiritual awakening at that time, and then he starts to make the masterpieces. Firstly with Miles Davis on albums like Milestones and Kinda Blue, and then with him on his own with albums like, you know, My Favourite Things and A Love Supreme, Meditations, but also the album he made with the vocalist Johnny Hartman, the album he made with Duke Ellington. It's just, I mean, if you look at the discography for Coltrane in the 60s, it's like this big. It's like hundreds of albums. And if you ever see a ranking in there, 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars, 5 stars. I mean, this is one of the greats, isn't it? John Coltrane. Speaking of Duke Ellington, that's what I've got for D. Duke. Duke was the privileged, educated, black genius of early jazz. He brings an intellectuality and refinedness, debonaireness, pride that wasn't necessarily there with the other jazz musicians who were playing hot. They were like, you know, coming out and really playing and getting there. You know, you go to the jazz club and they're doing all that stuff. Duke had that, you know, his music was called jungle music. He made his name because he was playing at the Cotton Club, and with the sort of in the 1920s where there was I think there was a lack of the material they made records out, so the records stopped being made. People turned to the radio, and he had a show being broadcast from the Cotton Club, which sort of made his name. And he got, you know, sort of labelled jungle music. This is one of the things that gets thrown against me, where people are saying, oh, you don't understand that the white people look down on jazz. No, they love jazz. They love jazz. But there were certain people that called it jungle music, but it was a marketing thing. And Duke Ellington was the one that was really called about, and he utilised that. And he actually played on that in his compositions. But what he did is he took that and he creates a compositional style which, in my opinion, is greater than the classical music style, because it considers the instrumentalists in his band. And you just get all these incredible genius compositions come out, and the guy is just dripping compositions. Mood Indigo is one of the greatest melodies of the 20th century, and he wrote it in a cab going to a gig or a recording session. He wrote it in his head. Duke Ellington, absolutely incredible musician, and he really brings... He's the guy that makes jazz what the beboppers were trying to do in the 1940s, was to make people see that jazz was really serious and really expressive. Duke Ellington had already done that. You know, the harmonic aspects, the arrangement aspects, the way he utilised soloists, the rhythm section, you know, the virtuoso bass players that came in, you know, that, rewrote the book on bass playing, which then rewrote the book on the sort of how the rhythm section works in music. I mean, this is the greatest big band of all time, possibly the greatest jazz composer of the 20th century, and one of the greatest pianists as well. So that's who we've got for D, is Duke. And we're 15 minutes in, so at this rate, I'm going to, again, have a video that is like sort of 5 hours long. So let's get a bit of a move on. E is for Elvin Jones, right? Elvin Jones, who became famous in John Coltrane's quartet, as we were saying. And he comes in and he takes jazz drumming, and rather than providing a swinging foundation, he's like the sea. He is like the soloist puts their boat out to sail on the sea that is Elvin Jones. And if you could sail against the winds and the waves, you will get propelled forth. But if you're not strong enough, he's going to take you over and he's going to pull you under. And that way of playing and that challenge to the soloists, you know, and that goes with a sort of commitment to playing drums. I remember reading when at the end of his life, Elvin had booked in these dates in a club, And he was very, very ill, but he was turning up every night and he was out there playing. And someone said, why is he doing this? He's so ill. And his wife, he had this little, I think, Japanese wife, and she turned around and said, he's trying to die on stage when he's playing. His commitment to music was ridiculous. Elvin Jones, probably my favourite jazz drummer. A powerhouse, nuclear physics of drumming. Really is. Really is. At number, not F, for F, I've got Frank. Now, there's only one Frank, and that is Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra emerged in the swing era in the 1930s. This sort of skinny, waif-like singer, singing in the Dorsey Brothers band. Before then, Bing Crosby had been a great singer, crooner, and Sinatra was also a bit of a crooner, but he straightened it out and he got more attitude in there. And really, his voice really is the voice of the first pop superstar. By the 1940s, he is like Elvis Presley, and he starts to get worshipped by teenagers. The old Bobby Soxers who would turn up to see Sinatra play. This is rock and roll. It's all happened before, you see. Frank Sinatra sold millions and millions of records. He is the voice of male jazz. He represents something that represents what jazz is as well. He always had great players behind him. Those Nelson Riddle arrangements. He's jazz. He's a jazz singer. That Sinatra is the embodiment of what jazz can be commercially. And what we have is one of the greatest artists of the 20th century, most popular artist of the 20th century, Frank Sinatra. So I think I'm glad I put him on for F. For G, I've got Grappelli, as in Stéphane Grappelli, who was a violinist in the Hot Club of France, a French group that took its sort of lead from the albums made in the 1920s by the sort of Joe Venuti, Eddie Lang groups. But what you had with Stéphane Grappelli and his teammate in that band, Django Reinhardt, is the first great American jazz soloist. Stéphane Grappelli is, I would say, he's in a handful of solo. He's underrated. Go and listen to him. He's one of the great. It's like Sidney Bechet, Louis Armstrong, Stéphane Grappelli, Django Reinhardt. These are the greatest soloists of all time. And Grappelli's so important because he's playing a violin, and he's playing a violin with that European lyricism, but he also swings and he understands the blues. And throughout his career, he was there all the way through. And he sounded as fresh right at the end of his career, still able to blow you away. He's still able to negotiate his way through all the things that happened in jazz, from bebop to modal playing. Such an incredible player. That's who I've got. So I'm going to get a bit of a move on there. That's who I've got for G, Stéphane Grappelli, who is the first great, along with Django Reinhardt, non-American jazz improviser. H, we've got Herbie. Not Herbie Man. Right, no. Herbie Hancock. Herbie Hancock straddles a huge period of jazz from the early 60s to now. Right, if we want to think that jazz is like 100 years old, and Herbie is pioneering jazz, is still around and was pioneering jazz for the last 60 years. That's quite, over 60 years. And so he starts off making, Maiden Voyage and, those albums, Imperial Islands, in the mid-60s. He's worked with Miles Davis in the mid-60s with the classic quintet. He is one of the great jazz musicians. He's also one of the great jazz rock musicians, and he's also one of the great pop musicians. Herbie Hancock can do it all. He really is one of the greatest jazz pianists of the last 60 years, up there for me with Bill Evans, Keith Jarrett, Chick Corea. So that's who I've got for H, is Herbie. From I, I've actually put down India. Indian music, Indian classical music is an interesting thing because it shares a lot of things with jazz, especially modal jazz. It's based upon a scale or raga. And that scale is often modal, so it has a tonal center, and you work around that tonal center. We don't have chords in there. We have this idea of leaving the tonal center and returning home, and being able to do that using sort of microtones, using bends, and using elaborate rhythmical devices to create the tension release required. This is close to jazz, but not like jazz. And with George Russell's groundbreaking, Lydian theory of chromatic organization, or whatever it's called, that book that comes out that influences musicians to try and free jazz by going to a modal way of playing rather than a chord progression way of playing, which ends up with the biggest selling jazz album in history, Kind of Blue, and then musicians then take that on, and then that way of soloing provides the bedrock for the sort of jazz rock soloing. Most jazz rock is not like bebop changes, it's modal. This is coming from India, and we see the influence of India on a whole host of artists, most notably Coltrane with his move to soprano sax and his modal playing on My Favourite Things and then Impressions. He also did a track called India that starts to try and incorporate the sort of droning and rhythmical roots of Indian classical music. Here in the UK, you've got Joe Harriott and John Mayer doing Indo-Jazz Fusions, one of the first fusions albums exploring very similar areas. Don Ellis brings in Indian elements into his fusion albums, like Electric Bath. Who else? Obviously, John McLaughlin with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and then later on Shakti. Miles Davis brings in those influences, bringing in sitar and tabla to his electric albums. So it just goes on and on and on, and that influence is huge in jazz. So I think India needs to be mentioned in our list at A to Z. That's what I've got for I. J, I've got Jelly Roll. Poor old Jelly Roll. Jelly Roll, Morton was a middle-class Creole in New Orleans, born way before Louis Armstrong. I think he was born in 1890, so he's a good 11 years before Louis. He's a good 7 years before Sidney Bechet. And he crosses the tracks. He crosses the tracks from his middle-class Creole background, and he goes down into New Orleans and he starts to take on all the stuff that's going on there. And he becomes one of the sort of professor jazz musicians. These are the musicians that are supposedly frequenting the whorehouses in New Orleans, although I think there was more. It was frequenting some of the establishments that were associated with that. Jelly Roll Morton then, because of his background, he brings Spanish influences into jazz. Not the only one, but he brings what he called the Spanish tinge into jazz. But what's most important in Jelly Roll is that in the 1920s, along with Louis Armstrong, he then starts making recordings where he utilizes the recording process, and he does this through arrangement, and he becomes one of the great early jazz arrangers. He's a fantastic pianist, and he gets known as being a boaster, and he said that he invented jazz, but actually in the late 1930s he sat down with I think it was Alan Lomax, John Lomax, and did a whole bunch of interviews. I've listened to them extensively, and it really gives you an idea of what was going on with early jazz. And I have to be honest, he's very modest on that, and he seems to make out that his genius was down to his limitations as a pianist, which I can't hear. He sounds fantastic to me. But his boast that he invented jazz, I think, is closer to the mark than we think. I really do. Because if you look at his age and the time he's playing and what he's around and what he brings in and what he does in jazz, and the fact we have some actual recorded evidence of what he was playing and how it sounded and how it was hot and swinging, and and not just what any of these early jazz groups that didn't record sound like, which they could have just sounded like, James Europe's group could just sound like a brass band. Or maybe a brass band with a bit of swinging. Jelly Roll Morton is so important to early jazz. And that's why I've got him on this list. And go and check out the 1920s recordings, because they're great. When I say this, it's because some of this stuff's difficult to listen to, but this isn't. It's great. And they tell stories and there's humour in it. So, yeah, go and check out Jelly Roll. K is for Keith. Keith Jarrett. A talent, an instrumental talent, the likes of which comes along once a century. Is Keith Jarrett the greatest musician of the latter part of the 20th century? Has anyone ever been greater than him in the scope, in the virtuosity, in the vision of what Keith Jarrett did for music? You know, a guy that can sit down in front of a piano and literally churn out masterpieces off the top of his head. I have a theory that Jarrett's actually, the only bad thing about Jarrett is he's sort of, his incredible talent created a certain arrogance and lack of humility, which I can hear in some of the music when he's at his peak. Recently, he's had a series of strokes, and now he's only got one working hand. We hadn't heard much from him for ages, but Rick Beato went out and interviewed him, and it's a magical thing. And he seems to have lost that sort of arrogance that is in many of the interviews that you can go and check out. I've really researched into Keith Jarrett, read the book on him. Ian Carr, I think Ian Carr wrote that book on him. I've read that. I've read another book on Jarrett. I've also gone through all his interviews. There's an incredible documentary called On Improvisation, which is a must for anybody who's a jazz fan, and it's incredible. And you really work out how brilliant Jarrett is as a talent, you know. And you can see, like when he books the tour with Chick Corea and they go out playing together, it's like Chick Corea's a bit intimidated by playing with Jarrett. So that's who I've got for K is Keith Jarrett. L, I've got Lady Day. Billie Holiday. The great Billie Holiday. I've spoken to her about her so much. I've got a whole video on her, and I really explore that incredible performance she does on television in 1957. You know, with all her friends, Lester Young and Ben Webster, and, you know, who else is on there? Jerry Mulligan's on there. Billie Holiday. She's not Sarah Vaughan. She's not Ella Fitzgerald. She's not Anita O'Day. She's not one of these high-powered virtuoso jazz singers. She can't scat and do all that stuff, you know. That's not what Billie does, but she's an out-and-out jazz singer. She's not a pop singer. She's a jazz singer. Because she's able to do what they do, but with the limited vocabulary that she had. She had a vocal range of about an octave. She had a tiny little voice, but she knew how to use it. She'd learned from Louis Armstrong, one of the great singers of the 20th century. But she was able to bring a sort of sadness and delicacy, which, when we think of Miles Davis with the 1950s and the power that Miles Davis had to change the face of music, the reason for that is because Miles Davis was a success in the 1950s. And the reason why this was a success, because Miles could play Someday My Prince Will Come, which is a cheesy song from Snow White. But because he's got this mournful, delicate female sound in his trumpet playing, it takes that melody and it transforms it. Well, for me, the musician that does that for jazz is Billie Holiday. And we hear that as soon as she emerges in the 30s. She follows on from Bessie Smith as the second great, you know, female jazz singer. But Bessie Smith, she's all brassy and loud and powerful. She's a big, strong woman, and it's just power. And, you know, your mum, her voice comes at you like fists, like a boxer. Miles has that too. But the sound that Miles Davis had, the ability to transform the popular song into something transcendental, really has its roots in Billie Holiday. So that's why I've got a Lady Day for L. M is for Miles Davis, and he's so great that I've mentioned him so many times. I was just mentioning him now. I've done the talk on Miles Davis, M, Miles, done. Right, who have we got at N? Right, I've actually got New Orleans. It's 2 words. I do apologise. 2 words. I've cheated here. New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz. A troublesome town, for me at least. I'm fascinated by the history of jazz, all aspects of the history of jazz. I've studied it for since the early 80s, probably 45 years. I wasn't just a jazz fan, I was a music fan. I love progressive rock, heavy metal, and all those styles. But the one I studied was jazz. For some reason, I had a greater interest in learning the history of jazz. I think these people were mythic to me because it was the way I was brought up by my dad. People like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong and Jelly Roll Morton. Eddie Condon, Buddy Bolden. Kid Ory. They were mythical. It's right. You want to know about the music you love, and you reach back, and you get to a point where you can't reach any further. You're just reaching into the fog, aren't you? And the fog is the fog of New Orleans. And I've studied it so much. I've done a whole documentary on early jazz. I've tried to piece it together. I've got frustrated by the whole sort of lens of identity politics, which I think stops us from seeing what was going on objectively. Because even if you believe identity politics is brilliant, which I don't, but even if you think it's brilliant and it's going to save the world and stop everyone being a racist, which it doesn't seem to be doing, but even if you do, you have to understand that was not there when jazz was being created. And so to understand what's happening, the way people thought and what they imagined and what they wanted out of life and what jazz represented to them. But it's all going on in New Orleans. The one thing I can say about New Orleans before we move on, New Orleans in the late 1890s was the most cosmopolitan, mixed cultured place on the earth. And it was a port city, so it was continually having stuff coming in. Right. O is for Ornette Coleman. One of the great jazz musicians, merged in the 1950s, shape of jazz to come. They're all trying to sort out how to move beyond bebop. How do you get out of the straitjacket of the chord progression of that sort of Charlie Parker type phrasing? How do you get out of going? How do you get out of that? Why do you do it? And everyone's they're thinking they've got to do it in some sort of intellectual way. They're looking at the harmony, they're looking at modality, free jazz, the rhythms, maybe they can use this, maybe they can do that. Ornette Coleman is an alto player, and he comes out of the lineage of Charlie Parker. He sounds like Charlie Parker, and I believe he could play bebop. But what he does is he just sort of takes Charlie Parker's spirit, and he takes it where he wants it to go. That's what he does. And there's a great sense of play with Ornette Coleman. I say this because Ornette Coleman, if you were to say free jazz, in my mind, the first musician I think of is Ornette Coleman. He invented free jazz, didn't he? But of course he didn't, because what Albert Island's doing, what Archie Shepp's doing, what all those guys are doing, Anthony Braxton, it's not what Ornette's doing. Ornette's something else. Ornette is very, very sophisticated child's play. And his influence on me as an improviser is absolutely huge. When I improvise, I like to create melodies. And those melodies are created by me, the expression of me. And I'm going to play my melody. And that comes from me. And I'm going to take that into account, because they're the melodies I play. I might hate them, I might like them, but I've got my own tune to play, and so have you. We all have our own tune. And that's what Ornette Coleman, that's what he breaks through to. In the same way as Bob Dylan is able to make it possible for everybody to sing a song, as long as they've got something to say. If you haven't got something to say, there's no point. But if you have, then you can say it in your song, and Dylan shows that. He democratizes that. And in a way, Ornette democratizes improvisation. And the jazz world can't stick it. They don't like Ornette, because Ornette says, well, you can do whatever you want to do. He brings in his son Donardo on drums when he can't play the drums, and he improvises against that. But I feel like Ornette could improvise against anything he wants to. He could improvise against a photocopying machine going off, you know. He could improvise with a car alarm if he wanted to. Because it's him. It's him. Ornette, one of the greats. Another great saxophone player, mentioned him earlier, was Lester Young. Lester Young, you know, when we look at the sort of way of categorising jazz musicians, we had the Count Bass, we've got Duke Ellingtons, we've got the King Oliver, we got Lady Day, Billie Holiday, and we have the president of jazz, Lester Young. Lester Young is possibly the second or third great saxophone player. Bechet's the first, but no one ever counts him as playing soprano sax. And then people say Coleman Hawkins came in and he invented saxophone playing. And he's got this very rhapsodic rubato sound, which actually to us can sound a little bit old-fashioned now. But everyone was playing like that. Then Lester Young comes in and he's got that straight-through, cool sound. He influences like Coltrane. He influences like Stan Getz. He influences Charlie Parker. Lester Young's just massive in terms of the way he solos. Never wastes a note. He's one of the most incredible soloists of the 20th century. I believe that his solo on that video with Billie Holiday that I mentioned earlier on that TV show, which I've done a whole documentary about, that solo is the greatest solo of the 20th century. Lester Young. But also Lester Young was a quiet, withdrawn guy, but he was a strange guy. He's the embodiment of jazz, weirdness. Dizzy Gillespie tried to do it, but Lester Young was it. And so he had his own way of talking, his own way of acting, his own way of referring to him. He had a secret language, which I think was about him looking after himself. He seems like quite a delicate guy. Of course, because he was a delicate guy, after traumatic incidents in the army where he ended up in prison for a year, and then also being attacked indifferent and racism and all the stuff, you know, by the time you get to the 1950s, he's drinking too much drug taking, and he passes away at the age of 50. You look at photographs of him, he looks like he's 70 years old, but no, he was, most of those photographs, he's in his 30s or early 40s. But he was something else. The Prez, Lester Young. Q. There's no thing for... Right, there's a saxophone player called Paul Quinchette or something. I thought I'd have him, but the one that's a little bit more famous than me is Ike Quebec. And Ike Quebec is a great saxophone player, emerged in the 1950s, signed to Blue Note, making some great hard bop records. Of course, of that generation, the 50s jazz musicians, where the heroin was such a problem. And by 1963, heroin had finished him off. He's the greatest musician I can find, beginning with Q. Right, it's R, I have got Rollins, Sonny Rollins, one of the great improvisers of the 20th century. Sonny Rollins is still around with us now, so he's one of those last contacts with the almost legendary period of jazz. He's one of the last connections to the bebop era, to the hard bop era. Sonny Rollins. What can I say about Sonny Rollins? I've spoken about him before on the channel. I've told all the stories. It's hard to keep... I always like to try and come up with something new about Sonny Rollins. And I've got something. When I was a kid, my dad had an album by Modern Jazz Quartet with Sonny Rollins on. That was the album I knew. Great player. I associate him as the same as Coltrane, because he was around about the same time. Tenor sax got quite a hard, aggressive sound. But whereas Coltrane takes it and goes off on this sort of, you know, spiritual enlightenment, Sonny Rollins just seems to keep going, exploring something that's much more, I can see now, nuanced. And I don't think I really got it that much, to be honest, when I was a kid. Checked him out. I didn't get it. And then when would it be? The early 90s, I saw a TV show of a concert, outdoor concert he'd done. I believe he had Marvin Smith on drums, but I might be wrong. I haven't got this recording anymore, and I haven't watched it for years. But that's where I became a Sonny Rollins fan, was that live concert, because he was playing with such... I mean, he's a virtuoso, and he can solo and solo. He's got continual inspiration, it seems. He's got so incredible ideas. But it wasn't that impressed me about Sonny Rollins. It was his commitment to the music. It's what I've mentioned so often. When you recognise it, when someone's connected is the best way. Sonny Rollins was connected. He was connected to something. Anyway, on this concert, there's a point where he's so involved in the music that he falls off the stage. And if I remember rightly, he lands and he breaks his leg. But rather than it be what you expect that all the people rush on, no, he just carries on playing. And he's there with his leg stuck up in the air, but still playing absolutely brilliant. He does not stop. Now, this is something I've pulled up here, and I hadn't planned on saying this. This could be a dream, because as I say it to you, it doesn't seem like it can actually be true. So can you check that out for me? Is there a concert where Sonny Rollins falls off the stage and breaks his leg but carries on playing? That's the challenge for you to see if that's the case. S is for Satchmo. Louis Armstrong. Satchel mouth. That's what Satchmo. Not shut your mouth. Satchel mouth. You know that thing Louis Armstrong does? When I do, I look more like Dame Edna Everage, don't I? I love Louis Armstrong so much. I love everything about him. I can't tell you how great I think he is. I think he's the greatest musician of the 20th century. I think he's the most important musician of the 20th century. I think he can do everything from out-and-out pop music, entertain the world. You know, he can entertain the kids. He's got that touch, that common touch. And he can also create the most important, greatest emotive music of the 20th century. He's an absolute genius who innovation just seems to drip out of him. And it's very rare. He has a joy. He has a joy about music. There's no angst there at all. He can use angst. He can bring angst into his music if he wants. You know, I mean, when he sings "We've Got All the Time in the World" right to the end of his life, and you know he hasn't, it's so moving. He is something else. The Hot 5, Hot 7's what I can say, most important recordings of the 20th century. He invents his popular music singing. He invents the language of swing. He invents the language of trumpet playing, of phrasing. Every musician that came in after him is playing their instrument as though they're Louis Armstrong. He was the first black artist to have their name above the title in Hollywood films because he was a Hollywood film star. It just goes on and on. There's nobody that achieved the same thing that Louis Armstrong achieved. There's nobody. It's something else. And this is someone that was born at the bottom of the pile in New Orleans. This is someone that if they hadn't have shot a gun off on New Year's Eve and got arrested and stuck into some waif's home where someone gave him a cornet, he loved the time in the waif's home because his life outside was so bad. He got fed and he got to play music. If that hadn't have happened, you do know that we wouldn't be here talking about this now. T is for Thelonious, as in Thelonious Monk. When I think of Thelonious Monk, I think of individuality. I think of a person that's, you know, they know all their stuff. I mean, Thelonious Monk in the late 30s is one of the world's great pioneers in music. He's up at Minton's, part of the house band. He's playing with Charlie Christian. Charlie Parker hasn't even come on the scene. These are the guys that are laying the groundworks for bebop. These are the guys that are going to push the music forward. But Thelonious Monk has a vision. He has a vision that is so unique that the music industry know how great his are, but the public don't. And from his first recordings under his own name in the 1940s for Blue Note, like the genius of Thelonious Monk, all the way up to, I think, different quarters in the 1950s, nobody's interested. You know, he's a very special soul. And, you know, he sat in a car one day with Bud Powell and Bud Powell smoking a joint and the police stop him and he takes the blame. So he gets banned from playing. He's not only like got his own sound and that the public aren't, you know, interested, but then gets banned from playing. But despite this, by the late 50s, he becomes one of the most important musicians on the planet. And he's not a Coltrane, he's not an Ornette Coleman, he's not a Miles Davis. It's not that he pioneered a way of playing. He just created a way of playing jazz, which is his. And this came through his take on the blues. He adapts the blues to his own end. And in that, he becomes the second greatest jazz composer of the 20th century, which is what he is after Duke Ellington. U is for Ulmer, as in James Blood Ulmer, right? The blues is really important to jazz. The blues has held its hands with jazz since the beginning of jazz, right? In the 1960s, when black American musicians started to stand up against the racism of the culture they were existing in, they went back to these forms. They went back to Africa, but they also went back to the blues. And if you think of someone like Albert Ayler, when you hear him, it sounds almost like he's back. It's super futuristic, but he's also back, isn't he? Back in he's back in the New Orleans. You can hear the funeral march towards the cemetery, and then the joy coming back. James Bull Ulmer is a guitarist that seems to have one foot in free jazz, one foot in the blues, one foot in Africa, and one foot in Leadbelly's American folk forms. He sings, he plays guitar. His album Freelancing in the early 80s is one of the great statements of that have come out of the harmonic approach of Ornette Coleman. The other albums would probably be Bill Laswell's, especially on his Basslines album. There's a sort of use of harmonics there, and Jamaline Takuma's, and they all work together. By far the most interesting is James Blood Ulmer. The guy's still around, he's 85 years old. Calvin Weston, the great drummer with Primetime, is a friend of the channel, and he is still friends with James Blood Ulmer, and I would do anything to get James Blood Ulmer on this channel. I don't know what I would say to him, because to me, this guy is connected. You see, it's always the same with me. He's connected, but what he's connected is right to the source. The source of everything he's connected to, and we don't know what it is. He does. Right, V is for Von, as in Von Freeman, a great saxophone player from the late 50s, early 60s, came out of that sort of, people call it West Coast, don't know that much about him, only the person I could think that came up with V, so I can't say much about him, and I might have got some of that wrong, and I do apologise if I had. I should have done a little bit of research on him, and he's taken me by surprise. W is for Wes Montgomery, the second great jazz guitarist after Charlie Christian, and Charlie Christian didn't make my list, did he? And with that, there's the first omission. So yeah, but Wes does. Wes changed his jazz guitar, and he emerges in the 1960s. He's quite old by that time, and he's been doing regular jobs. He's been playing on the weekends, but been doing regular jobs. So he'd come home and he'd practice at night time, and he didn't want to make much noise, so he started to play with his thumb. And with his thumb, he got a sound out of the guitar. And we all know this, us guitar players. We all know it sounds better when you play with your fingers or your thumb. The guitar's not designed to play with a plectrum. It takes out all the soul and depth out of the note. Wes Montgomery is able to play like someone who's playing with a plectrum, but with his thumb. His use of octaves, his double stops, and those beautiful lines, and the harmonic sophistication, he's just one of the greatest soloists. But the thing is, not only is he out there, and he's like, every guitarist after Charlie Christian is a Charlie Christian night, all of them. Until we get to the 1960s, then we get Jim Hall and we get Wes Montgomery. And with these two, they change the sound of the guitar, and they do it as the world's changing and moving from the saxophone to the guitar as the instrument of mainstream youth culture. And therefore, Wes's influence on guitarists like Jeff Beck, influences on guitarists like Jimi Hendrix, but also influences on guitarists like John Scofield and Pat Metheny is unfathomable. And he made popular albums, and he sold a ton of albums. So that's who I've got for W is Wes. X, couldn't come up with anything, so the only thing I could go with is Song X, the album that Pat Metheny made in 1986 with Ornette Coleman. On drums, Jack Jajonet and Donardo Coleman, and then on bass, Charlie Hayden. this is, I think, the greatest album of the 1980s. It brings together the whole jazz fusion thing. I mean, at the time, this was the first release that Pat Metheny made when he moved to Geffen Records in 1980s. We all thought he was going to get more commercial. And then he brings this album out. This is a major label, big push. They had a tour behind it. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I wonder what he's doing with Ornette Coleman. I can remember buying it and taking it home. And I was like, what? Dumbfounded. Didn't know what to make of it. That was my introduction to Ornette Coleman. I didn't really get it. I had to work at it. This album did this for so many people. It's incredible, absolutely incredible. Pat Metheny's playing is off the charts. He's playing a guitar that sounds like he's got a guitar sound and a guitar synth sound. And it sometimes sounds like the lines are moving in contrary directions. Quite incredible. Ornette swings. It's just fiery. You know, Donato Coleman's playing electric drums that gives you sort of 1980s futuristic sound. And then, you know, Jack DeJohnette is just bloody playing, you know. Oh, I just love Song X now. It's such an album. So that's what I got for X. Y, Yardbird, as in Yardbird. Charlie Yardbird Parker, the bird. Right, after Louis Armstrong, the most important soloist of the 20th century, the guy that embodies bebop, and in that embodies, you know, virtuoso playing. You know, there's two ways of playing jazz. There's Louis' way. You know, it's all that bit. Oh, and then there's and there's a Charlie Parker way of playing it. And Charlie Parker plays like a bird flitting over the top. And he's able to fly over these tunes. No one else has ever been able to do it, not without copying him. No one else has found a way of flying through the music. He owns it. He owns, you know, chopsy jazz solo. That's what everyone wants to sound like, Charlie Parker. But he doesn't sound like anybody when they're doing it. All these kids coming out of college and playing his licks, right? All these beboppers that came in after him, right? None of them sound like Charlie Parker, because Charlie Parker just sounds like, it's like a tap he switches on, and he's got a big grin on his face because he's just, oh, I love doing this. Let's go, you know. What can I say about him? Now, see what I've got second to last. So we come to Z, or in America, as they say, Z. And for Z, I have Zorn, as in John Zorn, the great sort of city New York avant-garde 80s jazz musician that seems to come in, take what Ornette Coleman's doing, mix it with a bit of like trash TV, a little bit of sort of 1940s noir, you know, Raymond Chandler, a bit of Napalm Death, thrash metal, and he puts it all together in this sort of thing which is almost like, you know, music for people with ADHD. Oh, I love John Zorn so much, and what an incredible saxophone player as well. And in his sound alto, so he refers back to Charlie Parker. You have the whole lineage there. He's made albums where he just puts musicians in the world and he creates in a studio, and he just gets like signs and different singles and holds them up and just creates improvisation on the spot. Massively influential on me, especially when I was teaching. He's done like an album full of Ornette Coleman tunes, but played as heavy metal. He's explored music of Ennio Morricone. He's of Carl Stalling, karting music. He's explored Jewish music. His band Naked City is one of the great jazz groups of the last 40 years. You know, making jazz fusion or jazz, or is it even prog? John Zorn's a mighty figure of the last 40 years. I have done a video on him years ago. I might have to come back to him again and do another one because I haven't talked to him about him for a while. Oh, did I make any mistakes this time? Nothing major, I don't think. These are hard to deliver, you know. It's like, I apologise about Von Freeman. Knew nothing about him when I got to that point, you know. Like I say, I don't actually research these. I do the list and I have a go. I should have had a look up something. Von Freeman. Was he Chico Freeman's dad? Chico Freeman. No one mentions Chico Freeman. He was an important player in the 1980s. I saw Chico Freeman on the TV once, and they were playing this free jazz thing. It was incredible. They were all going for it. And then on cue, they all stopped playing, but they carried on acting like they were playing. I thought I'd gone deaf. If you saw that live, it would have freaked you out. But I think it wasn't Chico Freeman. Von Freeman's son. Have I got that wrong? I don't know much about him. But the rest of it was all right on. If you like this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see some more, subscribe. If you want to support me, I have Patreon down below, and you can become a free member or pay member. I also have a YouTube, PayPal tip jar. I always have a theme. You know, every month I have a theme, and this theme this month is serious videos where I don't crack any jokes and I don't act up. I'm doing a few because I can't help it, but on the whole, we're doing some proper content. Back to some proper content, because some of you have said you wanted to see something like that. So just to prove I can still do it, and hopefully do it with a little bit more panache and a little bit more sort of naturalness than I did before, because I've got used to doing this now. Even though I've had people sticking their head round the door, I haven't gone off on any tangents, and I'm not going to now. See you on the next video.